Hello, I'm Hazem Seeker. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and economics. This week, a new dawn in Zimbabwe. They call him the crocodile, but can the new president attack the country's broken economy? Also this week, modern-day slavery in Libya. Migrants trying to escape poverty and conflict find themselves trapped in a people-for-profit economy. Plus, China's biggest social media company, Tencent, is now the fifth most valuable company in the world, nudging Facebook out of the top 5. Well, many young Zimbabweans are hoping this week will prove to be a watershed moment for their country's economic future, as well as its politics. After nearly 4 decades of Robert Mugabe's unchallenged power, the country's banking system, agricultural system, and industrial sectors are in urgent need of reform. One of the key challenges for Zimbabwe's new leader, Emmerson Mnangagwa, will be to transform the economy into one that can offer good employment opportunities. Andrew Simmons has more on the challenges ahead and why some people are skeptical.
It's a celebration of hope here, really, and so much of that rests with Emmerson Mnangagwa's ability to revive a shattered economy. Let's take a look at some of the faces here, because that level of hope is palpable, echoing around this stadium. The man himself is keen to do business, not just with China. He's established a good relationship there. There's plenty of business going on. But in past interviews, he said, we must look east. Well, now he's also looking west. There are so many things to overcome. Sanctions for one, bankruptcy another. The IMF, he wants to do a deal with them to fix a new program. And also, he needs to fix relations with international creditors. He's been supported so far in actually trying to get through that new program with the IMF. But the really first test of the new administration be whether or not it can actually get involved in good governance, whether it can address the issue of free and fair elections in the new year. There is a limit up to September, according to the Constitution, to have those elections. The West will judge him on that, particularly the United States, whether or not the opposition has a fair position, whether it can actually get heard and seen. Whether or not ZANU-PF will play its card right is, well, it remains to be seen.
Well, joining us from Harare is Samir Shasha. Samir is the CEO of Cambria Africa, which invests in the financial sector in Zimbabwe. Thanks for being with us. So what is it like? Give us a sense of what things are like on the ground right now. Is there a sense of hope there that big changes are coming? Or given that Mr. Mnangagwa is part of the old regime, could it just be more of the same?
I think there is a tremendous level of optimism in Zimbabwe at the moment. I think that people would be well advised to not expect too much too soon. There will be a lot of need for support and changes. I don't think that that the issue of more of the same is really relevant. I think it's quite clear that there's an interest in making changes in Zimbabwe and bringing about a new dawn. I truly believe that, and I think that, as I've said before, optimism is something that goes along with investing in Zimbabwe, and people are optimistic.
And as someone who does business there, what indicators, if any, are you getting about any changes that might be coming?
I am not hearing very much yet. I think the major issues here with business are deal with the international support for Zimbabwe, and Zimbabwe becoming more of a member of the international community with more rapprochement with the West. I'm not really hearing any news or differences, but I am hopeful. I'm hopeful that we will see more support for Zimbabwe coming from both the region and the West. We will see a greater degree of confidence and commitment, both from the outside and from the investors on the inside.
So what needs to be done then from your point of view to fix the finances in Zimbabwe?
I think one of the most important factors is that we mistakenly adopted the US dollar as the cost base of Zimbabwe. In this structure, I don't think that the US dollar made sense. It made us uncompetitive in many circumstances, especially when the rand depreciated dramatically. And it's not really correlated with the economy of the region. I think it's one of the major steps forward could be a participation in the Common Customs Union and the Rand Monetary Union. It would probably put an interesting discipline on monetary policy as well as fiscal policy and customs.
And as far as the foreign investment climate, do you see opportunities for improvement there? Because in the case of Zimbabwe, as with other African countries, there was a lot of the indigenization of finances. Do you see that as something that's going to be addressed?
I believe it is understood that the policy has hurt Zimbabwe in terms of how it's been implemented and looked at. I think that, when we look at the South African example, empowerment as opposed to indigenization is truly the way forward. And I think that if policies became more inclined towards empowerment rather than indigenization, you would have a greater comfort level as far as foreign investment is concerned. I think that if we look back, most of the laws here were based on creating some political favor, and I think that that will change. I believe that there's tremendous potential in empowerment, particularly because Zimbabweans have one of the greatest resources, and that's the resource of education. This is one of the most educated countries in Africa. It has the highest literacy levels. And the people of Zimbabwe who are no longer here, the expatriate Zimbabweans, if you will, are really economic refugees, and yet they've become economic refugees and very accepted around the world because of their education and because of their talent. And I think that that makes for one of the greatest foreign investments, actually the return of the diaspora, so to speak, to this country.
Samir Shasha, good to speak with you.
Good to speak to you. Thank you for having me.
And remember the Zimbabwean $1 trillion notes? Well, it's now a collector's item. The notes had the most zeros of any legal tender in all recorded history. They circulated for a few months in 2009 in one of the worst cases of hyperinflation. It's thought only a few million of them were ever printed. Now, a dream of a better life turned into a living hell on the shores of the Mediterranean. The UN-backed government in Libya said it is looking into allegations that African migrants are being sold in slave markets.
We are, from the head of the Presidential Council to the Interior Ministry and the department working against illegal immigration, dealing with this issue. There have been instructions to form an investigative committee to find the truth and capture those responsible and take them to court to be punished.
Now, according to reports, the trade works by preying on the tens of thousands of vulnerable people who risk everything on what's been described as the deadliest route on earth. They use smartphones to connect with people smugglers to get them to the coast in the hope that they can cross the Mediterranean into Europe. Mahmoud Abdul Wahed reports from a detention center in the capital, Tripoli.
These migrants were rescued by Libya's Coast Guard in the Mediterranean and brought here to this detention center in the Libyan capital, Tripoli. Now, they are from several African countries, and they say they have fled war, poverty and unemployment in their countries. Some of them say they have nothing at all to live on in their own countries. They have taken a tough journey through the desert, and they have paid people smugglers to get to Libya to try to cross the Mediterranean to Europe. With security and financial collapse in Libya, human trafficking and smuggling have become a growing trade. Not only African migrants who risk their life, but also many Libyan locals pay people smugglers to get to Europe through the Mediterranean. Despite European efforts to monitor the Mediterranean, this crisis does not seem to be ending any soon until order and stability prevail in Libya.
There is no proper registration for the tens of thousands of migrants when they arrive in Libya. Many are from West Africa, but also Somalia, Sudan, and Eritrea. But they come with very little money and are vulnerable to exploitation. Libya's economic and political chaos allows the armed militias and smugglers to operate with impunity, preying on these people for illicit profit. According to the reports, the business of detention centers is unsupervised in some parts of the country. Stories have emerged of torture, rape, and forced labor. And when the centers get too crowded, people are then allegedly sold off like goods in an open market. It's thought recent efforts to reduce the number of people crossing the Mediterranean are driving the growth of these privately owned prisons. The International Organization for Migration says trade in humans has become so normalized that people are being bought and sold in public for as little as $400. Well, joining us via Skype now from Geneva is Leonard Doyle from the International Organization for Migration. Thanks very much for being with us. So just give us an idea of what exactly is happening in Libya right now. Is there a slave trade there, and how is it able to operate in the modern age?
Well, shocking as it seems, it's indeed true. And the reason it can happen is because there's really no rule of law across much of Libya. Libya is a country as big as France. There's a lot of space there. The migrants are coming through. They see things on social media. They see it right here. They see the promise of a new life when they go through their Facebook feed, and they think something is wonderful waiting for them in Europe. Because a smuggler has abused the system and has sold them that lie. They get off the bus when they arrive in Libya, and they're quickly put into kind of a murder machine, an extortion machine, whereby they're robbed of their possessions, their families are called, they're forced, they're tortured, they give them money, and then they're sold. Unbelievable as it is, they're sold in open public auctions. $400 for a laboring man, maybe a bit more for a woman who can be put in the sex trade. And this is what's happening right across the country. So it's high time the international community spent more attention on Libya, for sure.
And how bad is this? What sort of numbers are we talking about here?
Well, there's about 1 million migrants living and working in Libya. They're not certainly all of them wrapped up in this, but many are being abused and extorted. The government is doing what it can. There are big issues in the country in terms of rule of law. The government does not control all of the country by any means. We work with the government to try and help them in the places where they keep migrants in detention. We wish they didn't. We want the detention centres closed down. But we also want to be there to bear witness and to make sure that the human rights abuses that have been reported and that are happening are at least not happening in the government centres. It's very difficult to control areas under the militia control. As is well aware to everybody, this is a very lawless country, and it's incredibly difficult to look after the welfare of the migrants. But what is particularly important now, I think, is that this issue is reaching global attention.
Indeed, and a lot of people will be shocked to know that this is a functioning slave trade economy that exists in the modern world.
I mean, it is indeed shocking. The modern day slavery is widespread right around the world, and Libya is by no means unique. It's happening in the developed countries of the world and the undeveloped countries of the world. But I think what's particularly shocking is that this is happening effectively in the open, where people can go to a farmhouse, place a bid, and end up owning, quote unquote, a human being.
So what needs to be done then to combat this? I mean, we've heard French President Emmanuel Macron this week calling for the UN to act in this regard. What needs to be done?
Well, I think the first thing that's happening is very important, which is a sense of collective outrage, which is affecting the politicians. We're seeing a call, as you rightly said, from the President of France. We've seen it from many people. Many leaders across Africa have come up and said this is unacceptable, and they've been talking to their Libyan counterparts and saying, well, what can be done? The what can be done, a lot of it's already happening. There's a lot of money and effort being spent by the European Union in particular in Libya in helping improve the rule of law, improve the conditions of migrants, but it needs to go a lot further. We need to see United Nations boots on the ground. There are some United Nations military in the country, but not enough, and they're not there to impose the peace, but they are there to protect the UN workers so that that can increase, so that there can be more humanitarian work. At the moment, it's a difficult and dangerous country to work in, and we need to expand that.
And is there a sense of a shared responsibility in all of this? I mean, it's very easy to blame Libya for all of this and the power vacuum that exists there. But this is a result of the fall of Gaddafi, which many Western nations had supported back in 2011. And there is the ongoing issue of migration to Europe and the lack of coordinated action by European nations there. So does more need to be done as far as the international cooperation on this?
Well, I think it's kind of easy to have that narrative that you've just given, and you know, and that's part of the story, undoubtedly. But the notion that that because one dictator was removed from power, that that's the reason for all this happening. Well, I think that it's got to be more than that. I mean, this is everybody's responsible for their own lives, and the fact that there's lack of rule of law or lack of central control in Libya is down to the civil war that's engulfed the country at the end of the day. But there is an international responsibility, which is to help when there's when there's a vast and huge humanitarian problem, as there is in Libya, and that's what needs to happen. We need to see a more assertive international reaction. I think it's, you know, there are many reasons that people are moving through Libya, and I would suggest that it's not always the ones we point to. Part of it is, you know, as I said, technology is changing, and so people can use a smartphone to figure out how to get there where they couldn't in the past. There is all sorts of issues like, are the states people come from, are they, you know, appropriate? Is the leadership giving enough opportunities to its citizens? Is there enough transparency? Are there gender issues? More broadly, are there climate change issues which are driving people off the land because they can't make a living and encouraging them to take a journey north? Are there issues of, you know, humanitarian issues like people being forced through violence to leave? Are they in fact refugees? So there's many parts of the story. I think the problem is that we've ignored this story because these were poor people from sub-Saharan Africa, and finally it's come to public attention and people are paying a bit more attention than they have been in the past.
Leonard Doyle, good to speak with you.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for inviting IOM.
Still to come on Counting the Cost. If a company that has your credit card address and tracks your movements was hacked, you would be alarmed. But what if it paid hackers to destroy the data? We'll look at why Uber is under pressure from regulators over a secret data breach cover-up. But first, when South Korea's economy was facing ruin 2 decades ago, many people living there still remember giving up their gold. Kathy Novak has more on what's happened since then.
For those who lived it, this was an unforgettable display of sacrifice and patriotism. Hit hard by the Asian financial crisis, South Korea's government asked the IMF for a $58 billion bailout, and the country wasted no time getting to work on paying it back. Millions donated precious family heirlooms to be melted into gold bars. Park Jun-hee was one of them.
I didn't hesitate to donate gold rings I got for my children's first birthdays and gold bands I got for my wedding. I was ready to give those up if it was going to help my country overcome the crisis.
As a financial crisis swept the region, it became clear South Korea had built up crippling foreign debt. Imports exceeded exports by more than $20 billion. It was a shock for a population that had been enjoying a booming economy just the year before.
Millions of people have been fired, and a lot of, especially in the financial area, a number of small banks has to close down.
The gold went some way to helping, even if largely psychologically, and thanks to economic restructuring and currency movements, South Korea bounced back, repaying its debt to the IMF in about 3 years. Today, this country is often held up as an economic success story. The booming stock market, a sign of investor confidence, especially in companies such as Samsung and Hyundai. And GDP per capita has more than tripled in the 20 years since the crisis. There has also been a trade surplus in the billions of dollars for almost 6 years.
Apparently, Korea is doing pretty good just to the eyes of foreign investors. But if you look at inside the Korean economy, there are many problems.
Among those problems, rising youth unemployment.
There are a lot more job seekers in Korea than 20 years ago. Many people now are highly educated. I feel that there aren't enough jobs for these highly qualified people.
In my parents' generation, a college diploma guaranteed a job. Nowadays, everyone has a university degree, so we're faced with more fierce competition.
It's not much better for those wanting to start a small business. About 4 out of 5 new businesses fail. Park Jun-hee says she's seen this and worse before.
I hear the current situation is very bad, but I believe we can get through this hard time just as we did in the past.
But in a recent survey of 800 South Koreans, less than 30% said they would donate gold today if their country faced another crisis.
Now, some other stories we're watching this week. Tencent is now worth $500 billion. China's biggest social media network and gaming giant made headlines when it became the first Asian company to surpass that valuation mark. Its share price rose on news that it's planning to expand its WeChat payment services in Malaysia. Tencent is now the 5th most valuable publicly traded company in the world, edging Facebook out of the top 5. Here in the Middle East, Dubai real estate developer Emaar Holdings launched the biggest initial public offering so far this year. But reports say it struggled to complete the $1.3 billion listing due to geopolitical worries. The company is the development arm of government majority-owned Emaar Properties. It owns units in Dubai's Burj Khalifa, the world's tallest tower. The CEO of the Qatar Stock Exchange says it's past the shock of the blockade imposed on Doha by some Arab states and is now operating normally. Qatar's central bank also sought to reassure investors. It said it will honor commitments to provide dollars to local and foreign investors at the official exchange rate. It described a proposal by index provider MSCI to use the offshore rate to value the country's stocks as unjustified. And finally, Uber has revealed that it suffered a massive data breach affecting 67 million people, but kept the details quiet for more than a year. The hackers say they found the data on an Amazon cloud server used by the ride-sharing company. They say they were paid a $100,000 ransom to keep the breach quiet. Here's Alan Fisher.
It's not just the hack that's causing problems for Uber, it's the cover-up. The loss of personal data of 57 million customers and drivers worldwide is bad enough. But the company took extreme measures to cover it up for more than a year, and that will cause huge problems. The company's new chief executive officer, Dara Khosrowshahi, who only took over in September, has said in a statement, "None of this should have happened, and I will not make excuses for it. We are changing the way we do business." It was October 2016 that hackers pulled names, email addresses and phone numbers of 50 million Uber users worldwide. The personal information of 7 million drivers was taken as well. But the company insists no credit card information, social security numbers or trip location details were stolen. The company had a legal obligation to report the hack to regulators and tell drivers their license numbers were taken. But it didn't do that. Instead, it paid a $100,000 ransom to keep the hack quiet.
No doubt that recent news is great ammunition for people who oppose Uber. It's also probably quite good news for Uber's competitors, so companies like Lyft and other ride-sharing companies. It's not clear that Uber will be able to survive if it continues down this line of corporate culture and mismanagement. They have many incentives to make sure that these issues don't happen again.
British regulators are looking into the breach, and the Attorney General in New York has launched his own investigation. It's not the first time Uber has run into problems. In March this year, the founder was recorded arguing with one of his own drivers. He later apologised. More than 20 people were fired after an investigation into sexual harassment at the company. In London, the first steps have been taken to ban the company outright because of what was described as reckless behaviour. And on Tuesday, the company was fined almost $9 million in Colorado after investigators found it was employing 57 drivers who either had failed or should have failed criminal background checks.
There were violent offenders in there, and there were also people whose license had been revoked because of DUI, and they were letting those people drive anyway, and they knew it.
Uber is a worldwide company valued at around $69 billion. It's now facing massive new fines and a series of civil suits from those hit by this latest breach.
And that is our show for this week. Remember, you can get in touch with us by tweeting me at @HazimSeeker and use the hashtag AJCTC when you do, or drop us an email. countingthecost@aljazeera.net is our address. There's more for you online at aljazeera.com/CTC. That'll take you straight to our page, which has individual reports, links, and entire episodes for you to catch up on. That's it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Hazim Seeker from the whole team here. Thanks for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.